This is a stain on the honor of the United States. I hope and pray the President will reconsider this. I know that every national security advisor understands that the time is not right to withdraw.
Honestly, this makes what Obama did in Iraq. It's replicating that, but in many ways, it's even worse.
I believe it is a catastrophic mistake that will have grave consequences for the United States, for our interests, and for our allies in the months and years to come.
All those senators you heard, they are all Republicans livid about President Trump's move to withdraw troops from Syria. Lawmakers were not the only ones shocked. The entire national security apparatus completely caught off guard. And of course, Trump, he announced the move with what else but a tweet saying, "We've defeated ISIS, so it's time to go." Trouble is, ISIS has not been defeated. And that's not my opinion. That's according to the Pentagon. And now lots of our enemies like Iran and Putin, well, they've gotten a gift. This was also the last straw for Defense Secretary James Mattis, as you know. The general said he is not aligned with the president, so he is leaving effective February. Here, a portion of his resignation letter to Trump, and you don't have to try too hard to read between the lines. My views, he wrote, on treating allies with respect and also being clear-eyed about both malign actors and strategic competitors are strongly held and informed by over 4 decades of immersion in these issues. Because you have the right to a defense secretary whose views are better aligned with yours on these and other subjects, I believe it is right for me to step down from my position. And joining us now, I can't think of a better person to speak to the issue, retired 4-star General Wesley Clark. Among many other things, Clark was also NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, a Rhodes Scholar, and awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. General, thank you for the time. There's a lot to unpack here, but I want to remind everyone what the president had to say as then-candidate Trump about both ISIS and the generals.
I know more about ISIS than the generals do, believe me. I would bomb the out of them.
2 points, General. First of all, ISIS is not defeated. That, according to the Pentagon, I'd assume you'd agree with that. And also the idea that a man who never once spent one day in the military or shown any respect to the military since even becoming commander-in-chief, that he would know more than the general since he doesn't read briefing books. Speak to both the issue of ISIS and his knowledge of the subject.
Yeah, well, obviously he's speaking incorrectly about ISIS, but it's a man who's spoken incorrectly about many things. He does what he wants to do, but in this case, there's no strategic logic for it. And all the logic runs the other way, to stay engaged. And Richard, what really concerns me about this is when Mattis was there, he was a proponent for the security system that was established by the United States that helped us win the Cold War, that's generally kept peace and security ever since. That is, we work with our allies, the people that share our values. We use force only reluctantly, and we magnify our power by working with others. What President Trump has is a much different vision. He demeans our allies, diminishes our alliances, and he cozies up to dictators and authoritarian regimes that don't share our values. He's going to end up leading an America that's more isolated, less capable, and less secure than he found it. That's the real message of Jim Mattis's resignation.
And how about the word of America? And to that is, even if you inherit as a president, as most presidents do, policies or military positions or involvements in wars that wouldn't have even been of your own choosing, if we give our word to not only our allies, but people we ask to fight with us, and in this particular case, the Kurds, to go back on our word, not just to those people who intelligence says the Turks are getting ready to slaughter here, but why would anyone trust America's word going forward? You don't leave any man behind. And isn't this exactly what we're doing to the Kurds who we asked and pledged to serve with us and support?
You're right. It's a shocking betrayal of their loyalty and their friendship to the United States. But I think in this case, they recognize this is President Trump. This is not the United States. This is the President of the United States, and he's a different animal. And so the damage is not yet irreversible, but he will pick people who share these views. He'll reverse 70 years of American foreign policy, and he'll make some sudden moves, and they will have enormous consequences, not only for us, but for the people who have historically trusted us and depended on us, like the Kurds. So I think it's going to be a very difficult time for those who were America's allies in the Middle East. I think they're going to find that we're not there for them the way we believe we should be.
And General, there's the policy part and then the process part. I mean, good and decent people can disagree. Not every commander-in-chiefs, regardless of their political party's decisions, have always been agreed to, Lord knows. But to not connect with anyone in the chain of command, I mean, this week, we were sending messages that we thought ISIS and believed ISIS, our own DOD, were still active and a real threat, and we were there for the long haul. Via tweet, he doesn't go through any of the proper chains of command, let alone notifies any of our allies that this will be a sudden and a swift measure, only to be doubled down the next day by his announcements regarding what his plans are, at least for Afghanistan. The process part of this, I'm curious, since he was one of the last adults in the room, if you were General Mattis, would you have any other choice but to walk away, even if you were leaving a more dangerous place behind?
Well, no, General Mattis did the right thing. He's been undercut by the president many times, and this is just the latest. And he can't represent the United States to our allies because he doesn't represent President Trump's views. And he's not listened to by President Trump. So Jim did the right thing. He left. And that was the honorable thing to do and the right thing for America. The United States has to face the consequences of having elected Donald Trump. And so the first order of defense really is the United States Senate. It's dominated by the Republican Party. The Republican Party in the Senate has been very loyal to the president thus far. They have mostly supported him on every single issue. They've refused to question his motives. They've refused to even enforce the emoluments clause of the Constitution. And if this continues, then you will have a new foreign policy and a more isolated and less secure America. If the Republican-dominated United States Senate stands up to the president, says, just a second here, you've got to show a logic to us before we go along with what you're doing. What's the logic of these pullouts? What are you doing to bridge the gap? You're leaving security vacuums in place. What about the people that supported us? What's the next step in the region? How do we deal with Iran? How do we deal with Russia? What's the threat to Israel? All of these issues needed to have been discussed. It's not that the president doesn't have the right to change the foreign policy. Of course he does. He's the commander-in-chief. But he has to do it with a logic, and he has to do it in consultation. He can't just say, my gut tells me this is the time to get out. His gut's not the right reasoning mechanism for this right now. And so the problem isn't that he's made what looks like an arbitrary decision. I'm sure there were long discussions in the White House over many years. He knows exactly what his advisors feel about this. He simply feels otherwise. But the problem is, what's the logic? What's the consequences? What's the strategy of doing what he's doing? There doesn't seem to be one. And that's what the Republican Senate should be demanding at this time.
And there's a consequence to some gut policy here. Talk about the void that gets filled the minute we leave Syria, and against the national security interests of America, some of the players that will fill that void.
Right. Well, we know the Russians are in there. Now, the American presence there has resulted in an airspace control envelope over Syria in which the Russians didn't have full freedom to operate. It's also resulted in intelligence collection so that, let's say, if there were extraordinary uses of chemical weapons, we would know about it. So if we leave and when we leave, both those two conditions will be absent. The battlefield will be clear for Syria, Russia, Iran to do whatever they might, and for Turkey, we might add as well. The losers will be the Kurds and whatever fragment of resistance to the authoritarian regime of Bashar al-Assad remains. And the consequences would be a Russia much emboldened, much stronger, much more capable of interfering with other nations in the region.
You know, General, I find myself asking questions that I would have thought somebody with a tinfoil hat would have asked, but I want to remind everybody what happened in Helsinki, because for some people they're saying as bad as today was, it's not as bad, but in the area code is that performance of our president standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who orchestrated the hacking of our election. This again, everyone, when President Trump was at that summit in Finland standing next to Vladimir Putin.
They think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial.
Not trying to relitigate this. We all know all our intelligence agencies said it was Russia. The president knew that, chose to disregard it. But I have a different question. How do we even know at this point, and how can we even dismiss the possibility that the president took a military position this week in terms of withdrawing us from Syria that's advantageous to Russia because he wanted to act in the best interests of Russia? The fact that we can't even dismiss that as a possibility is so frightening.
Yes, it is frightening, but it is a legitimate question. What the president has done is do everything he can to obstruct and block the Mueller investigation. And we know for a fact on what's already come out is the president has for a long time taken Russian money. A lot of it, possibly, according to the rumors out there, is illegal Russian money through money laundering. Maybe President Putin has evidence of this that he's holding over his head. We know President Trump wanted to build, his organization wanted to build a hotel in Moscow, apparently even offering President Putin a $50 million penthouse on this hotel. Now, of course, that is a prima facie violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States. So that's a criminal act to make such an offer. And if a private citizen did it, and it was detected, which it would be, they'd be in for a really tough time. So we know that there's lots of things out there. The president could have solved all this by releasing his tax returns. He could have obeyed the emolument clause of the Constitution, which says get rid of conflicting private interests. Don't take money from foreign governments. He's refused to do all of that. So he's really brought all of this on himself, the legitimacy of questioning his motives. It's a legitimate question. Who is he working for and why? It doesn't seem to be working in the interests of the American people.
Well, after he took this position for the first time, as we showed off the top, I saw some Republicans speaking that weren't just leaving or retiring in November, in January, taking the president to task. One was Lindsey Graham. And the president shot back saying, hey, can't believe you don't want to have our troops come home for Christmas. Shame on you, in effect. I'm curious from somebody who's
troops home.
Right.
But nobody wants to be over there. The troops don't want to be there. They're doing it for the United States of America. And they know it's tough duty. President Trump hasn't even been over to visit our troops in combat zones. But, you know, we all want them home. That's not the issue. The issue is what's good for the country.
And at least what I've heard anecdotally is the military themselves, certainly I don't think a group anyone would label Bleeding Heart, they're livid at this policy. They know what the situation on the ground is and what they're going to leave behind, both in Syria and Afghanistan. I don't see cartwheels happening where we're based there right now. Is that a fair representation?
Well, I think the military has real concerns, and they have personal feelings for these men and women that they've worked with overseas. But that's a totally secondary consideration. Look, the personal feelings of the military have nothing to do with national policy. The job of the military is to go where we're told to go and do what we're told to do. And if the president says we're coming home, we're coming home. Doesn't matter what your feelings are. But the professional judgment about U.S. security policy, now that's a different issue. And so the military has said that the battle's not over. The military said we need leverage to work against the Taliban and ISIS in Afghanistan. And both in Syria and Afghanistan, the president's made these decisions to effect withdrawals against, it's not just against military advice. It's against the logic of U.S. national security. And it's not that the military says it so. The military doesn't have a monopoly on what's good for national security. It only has its own recommendations and perspective. But there has been no logic expressed that can sustain the idea of withdrawal. There's no basis for it.
You are the Supreme Commander of NATO. I can only imagine what our allies think tonight, but I was really surprised, General. 2 former Republican secretaries of defense said tonight that they do not believe the president is fit to serve. Would you go that far?
Well, I think that's fit to serve is 25th Amendment business, and that says there's something wrong with the president. I don't see him as a man who's mentally disabled. What I see is a man who's willful, a man who is flaunting the laws and the traditions of the American presidency, a man who is trying to have it both ways, to be the president of the United States, to do what's good for his business, and we don't know really where his interests lie. We don't know whether Russia's got a hold card on him or not. And I think this is a man, President Trump, who's very hardworking. He's very skillful at manipulating public opinion. He's a very tough-minded guy. A lot of people underestimate him because sometimes he has misspellings on Twitter. This is not a man to be underestimated. This is a willful, very intelligent, very determined guy who, for whatever reason, has made it his effort, his legacy, to destroy the system of American national security that every president since World War II has labored to put in place, and that has kept America safe and made us strong. Why is he doing this? And there's no logic for it. And that's the real issue at the heart of the Mattis resignation.
General Clark, I really appreciate the time tonight in what has been just an amazing and a depressing week. But General, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Richard.
All right, when we come back, how does it feel to be a Republican in the age of Trump? Certainly the commander-in-chief keeps changing his mind, as we've seen this week. He breaks his word, and he's hanging out his own party to dry. Well, one person who should know this is as good as anybody, Congressman John Faso. From New York, he will be leaving here as a result of the election in just a matter of weeks. He'll tell us how it is dealing with all the insanity that is D.C.